Check, 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 check. Hello, and welcome to another fantastic Gnomon live stream. I'm Chris, your host. I was just checking my mic to make sure that it was working, and it seems like it is. So I'm excited about that. I'm so excited to have you here as well. Before we get started, make sure that if you're looking for closed captionings, you head over to our Facebook or our YouTube page. Also, we would like to thank Dell and NVIDIA right here for sponsoring this amazing industry live stream. Without them, we wouldn't be able to provide you with such amazing content as you're about to see right now. Hello, everyone in the chat. That actually brings me to my next point, which is I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions throughout this stream. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat as they come to you, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end where we can talk and ask our guests all of these questions, or as many as we can get through, and it's going to be a pretty great stream. We're going to be seeing and getting into a lot of great stuff. Well, Chris, who's our guest? You can probably see on the bottom right here, but in case you don't know, our presenter is a lead senior 3D environment artist specializing in creating high quality assets and environments with over 8 years of experience working on cinematic trailers and VFX productions at Platige, Goodbye Kansas, MPC, Axis Studios, and others. I mean, the list is long. There were other things that I could put in this list, but I just figured and others was going to be good enough. Having worked on over 40 projects, he's optimized his professional workflow to create optimized, precise, and versatile models for productions. I'm ready to get into it. So without further ado, please help me introduce Dmitry. There it is. I got it right.
Hello and thank you. First of all, thanks everyone for joining the stream, and it's a privilege to be here and to be able to speak on this event. So let's start with the show, I guess.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Now you have like a presentation for us a little bit out the gate here.
So I have a little presentation. I have a few videos that I would like to share. So I will start with my showreel, which is something I did a couple of years ago, and this was as I was finishing my career in cinematics, and I was moving towards VFX a bit. I'm gonna play it without music so I could talk a bit over it. So, as you mentioned, I worked on over 40 trailers and other projects, and because I was working in cinematic studios, which are highly fast-paced, we were making a cinematic or a trailer or a cutscene about every month or so. So you can see some of them here. This was Love, Death and Robots from Netflix. We're gonna speak about some of those projects a bit later, and I'm gonna speak about my personal projects as well, which are not part of the showreel. I see lots of hellos on the chat, so hello everyone. In addition to showing all those things today, we're also going to be doing a small demo. I'm going to be doing a Substance Painter texturing. I will be texturing a small prop with some metal paint and some other stuff. So stay tuned and you're going to see.
I gotta say, Dmitry, some of these are just phenomenal. It's exciting to see from my perspective because I can't imagine what it would be like just the opportunity to be work on some of this awesome stuff. Like League of Legends was in there, Destiny was in there, obviously Elder Scrolls was in there, Halo Infinite. I mean, do you ever like pinch yourself?
Yeah. To be fair, like some of those projects growing up as a teenager and especially like the trailers of the Elder Scrolls Online, those were the trailers that I was kind of growing up on, and I was always impressed by the quality Blur Studios were outputting. So whenever we had the opportunity and we did one in Axis Studios, I was totally lucky to be working on this. So if you missed the showreel, you can see some of the stuff on my outstation. But without further ado, I'll show you. I'll start with my presentation. So what you're seeing here is the only screenshot of my first models that I've ever saved. This was in 2013. This was not poly modeling. This was done in ZBrush using Shadowbox. I had no idea what polygons are. I had no idea what any healthy or efficient workflow as well. But in 2013, I tried a few different programs. I couldn't get into any of them. I downloaded ZBrush. Something in the UI, just because it was so weird, spoke to me, and I managed to play with it a bit more than the other programs. And at the time, I was playing Far Cry 3 and Black Ops 3 and some other first-person shooters, and I decided to make this AK. So it's not looking great, but it was the first model that I've created in 2013. And this was kind of the beginning of my career. So after that, I tried moving on into Maya because I was explained a bit more, and I started watching tutorials and understanding a bit the workflow and what 3D is. And this was right before the start of my studies. And I knew that we're going to be studying Maya, so I wanted to get a small head start, and I started using it. So I've created this tower. It was terrible, but I was really proud of it, and I was heavily influenced by games back then. I was playing Assassin's Creed and Batman Arkham City. And Assassin's Creed in general, I think back in the day, they were highly influential games, especially on me. And I was heavily inspired with them throughout my career. And you can see it in the next image. This was 2014. I think it was after watching Assassin's Creed no, sorry. I think it was Assassin's Creed Unity cinematic. And I was really impressed by the environments, the output of Paris, but also I was also still playing Assassin's Creed 3. So you can see there's like a weird mix of architecture going on here. And I had really no idea what I was doing. And instead of beveling or using hard edges, I was just adding subdivisions and using creasing tools, which somehow in the end helped me to develop my own workflows. So this was right before the studies, and we're gonna come back to this model. I was watching Game of Thrones, and as you can see, just as everybody else, I was really influenced by stuff that I was seeing, the other VFX stuff that other artists were creating. So I was trying to match their quality, and I was trying to be like them. So I did this model of Tyrion Lannister, which looks nothing like Tyrion Lannister now, but back in the day when I was making it, I was really proud of it. And I was kind of branching out into characters because I didn't know what I will be doing, because characters were good and environments were looking good and props and weapons were very exciting. So I didn't really find what I wanted to do. So I just kind of tried and did everything. And this was the first college project that we were assigned. And the duration was about 2 months. Because of different circumstances, it kept dragging, which was the reason why I was successful. Because at that point, I was somewhat arrogant, and I said to myself, I'm going to make something big. I'm going to make a vehicle. And everybody told me, no, vehicle is big, vehicle is complex. I was like, nah, I'm going to do it. So I did it, and it was in Lightwave. Not in Maya, it was in Lightwave, and this was looking really bad, but at the time, I didn't have the eye or artistic experience to give myself honest feedback. I was looking at it and I was in love with my work, so I just kept adding stuff around it instead of improving the model. And at this point, I also tried and textured stuff procedurally, because I said, I'm going to create everything from scratch, and I'm going to just use procedural textures for the ground, for the wood, for the rusty sink here, for the bricks. And it was looking terrible, but simply because I was thinking back in the day that texturing procedurally is the best approach, because otherwise you're cheating if you're using photo textures. I went with this approach, and you can see how bad it was looking. And I think this is one of the common mistakes that people still make to this day, especially in the beginning of their career. They are trying to create everything from scratch, which it has its benefits if you kind of split it into smaller parts and you master each workflow separately. But if you are just trying to bite something too big, and you just gonna fail. And I guess that's one of the first lessons that I've learned. But like I said, lucky for me, we had some extra time. So what happened, I picked up UVs, I picked up texturing, and I managed to take that project into this. And it took me from, I think from June 2014 to August 2014 to get to here. But the moment I started using photo textures, instead of trying to generate everything procedurally, and the moment I was slightly more honest with myself regarding how stuff should be looking and how bad it was looking, quite frankly, I got to much better results. And this was 2014. This was my first big project. And this was my first big environment, actually, because prior to that, I was just playing around with small individual props. But in here, as you can see, there's a lot of stuff going on. And this was 2014. So this has taught me a lot of lessons. And like I said, it's important to prioritize quality over quantity, which I didn't understand at first. And the moment I started understanding it, I started dialing down the quantity that I was producing, and I was focusing on quality. So instead of making a car in a garage, I had a few spare weeks between projects in the college. And I think if we have students here, my recommendation, if you have spare time, don't just stick a box and do your assignments. Whilst you still have the energy, whilst you are really invested and you have the help from your tutors as well, try to do other things as well on the side. So if you're doing an assignment and you feel that you have some bandwidth to do something else, do it, because it's going to give you the benefit of having your tutors giving you feedback on that as well. And you're going to have a much better portfolio overall than just having the assignments that are given to you by default. But like I said, prioritize quality, because if you start prioritizing quantity, it might necessarily work in your benefit. So this was a project I was doing in the college. We were assigned to do a dragon, so I tried to do a dragon of Game of Thrones, and I did a small character. Like you can see, I was all over the place. I was doing props, I was doing vehicles, I was doing characters, I was doing creatures. And I still didn't know what I will be doing. And this was 2015. And what happened in the end of 2015 is that I think Witcher 3 had a few trailers coming out, and The Order 1886 was very popular at the time, and also Assassin's Creed Syndicate. So what I did, I started blocking out an environment. I was looking at the reference images and the concept art of Assassin's Creed. I was heavily inspired, and I never was in UK before, and I had no idea how it looks like. So I just started putting together a scene, and what happened is that I defined my career because at that point I understood I enjoy environments and I enjoyed classical paintings before. So I kind of enjoyed creating a look, almost like a concept, but just taking something from scratch to a finished stage, and basically what a generalist does. I've heard some noise. Did anybody have a question or something? Perfect. Basically what happened on this project, in the beginning, it wasn't going smoothly, and I had a bit of an imposter syndrome, and I had ups and downs. But what helped me is that I started asking people for feedback, started asking the online communities. Facebook at the time was very active, 10,000 hours. level up groups as well. ArtStation, I think at the time was just starting to be active, so I didn't post it in the beginning. I only posted it after it was done. And I think also what I did, I started messaging people, and I started reaching out to people that worked in studios that I wanted to work in. And it might not necessarily be the best practice because you're essentially just spamming people. But because I wasn't doing it in a way that I unfortunately see a lot of people doing on Instagram, when they just must send a message, hey, give me feedback. No, I was personally reaching out to each person that I wanted their feedback. I was complimenting on their portfolio and explaining why I wanted their feedback. And out of maybe 100 emails, I got maybe 5 people to reply, but that was the best feedback to this day that I got in my life about the piece. Basically, it was just tons and tons of things to address, and I sat with myself. I was addressing note by note, and I managed to get this piece to this stage, which, again, considering that I did everything here from scratch, except for textures that I downloaded from goodtextures.com, which is a free resource, I think it's not too bad for a student. So that was 2016, and having this and the motorcycle and the dragon and a couple of other things that I've shown you in my portfolio, that was enough for me to land a job. And I think, like I said, it's important to focus on the quality and have just a few pieces that really define and show your abilities. And it's gonna take you really far. But because the job that I started, we were working on a lot of stylized stuff, I didn't stop there, so I kept working on personal projects. And I started finishing projects I started prior. So I came back to doing a Tyrion Lannister. This time it was season 5 Tyrion Lannister, not season 4 like before. It was beginning of 2016. And because I was doing stylized projects at work and then realistic stuff at home, and it was different enough and I was interested, it was sustainable. I think that personal projects can be a bit of hit and miss, especially if you have a lot of work to do. So to me, back in the day, this was more sustainable. And again, I wanted to achieve great things. So in the first year, right after college, I think I did over like 6 or 7 personal projects of this scale and more, which, again, not very sustainable when I look at it now. It was okay for me then, but I wasn't sleeping a lot. I was not going out. I was not doing a lot of other things. Nowadays, I wouldn't be able to know would I want to do something like that because I was completely burnt out. But again, back in the day, I think this is what helped me to get a nice head start in the industry. So as I mentioned before, I was still not entirely sure if I don't want to be doing characters, but after that, I kind of started moving towards environments a bit more. But one more character, which I never finished, that was 2016. So middle of 2016, there was a big ArtStation challenge, and I decided to join. It was very difficult simply because I was overkilling it. Like, for example, the boat that you see here is here. I was putting way too many details into stuff that shouldn't have had it. I probably would have been better practicing a more matte painting approach, but instead of doing everything in 3D. So I was working on it for a few months. I didn't manage to finish it on time. So in the end of the challenge, I did get a honorable mention, which allowed me to get enough exposure and enough interested in me from studios to start asking me to relocate. But I kept working on the piece afterwards to bring it to this result. And again, a lot of important takeaways here and a lot of important lessons. I think I was arrogant enough, but I was following through. So I wasn't managing to hit my ambitions, but what I didn't understand at the time, I was never managing to hit them on time, which when you work in a studio can be very hazardous, because if you don't have a clear evaluation of how long things take you, and you say, oh, no problem, I'll do it in a couple of months, but then it takes you 4 months and you passed your deadline, it will be a problem. But again, working on a personal project, not necessarily a bad thing, but you will see that the more I go further with the other personal projects towards the end of the year, the quality was diminishing, but also the scope, because I just simply couldn't do it. Which again, I think it's important. It's an important lesson to not burn yourself out. And I'm gonna speak about things that I do now to kind of balance the life and work a bit better. So that we spoke about it. And at this point, in the end of 2016, I was already in conversation with Axis Studios, who have seen my entries to the Challenge on ArtStation and some other pieces I had there. And I was relocating to UK, and I'm still living in UK to this day, still in Glasgow. And at that point, I was starting to understand better professionally what I want for myself. I was working in the studio. I was being mentored by fantastic colleagues, and some of them, they were teaching in my old college. So it was an amazing experience. And I started understanding that if I wanted to learn something new, maybe I shouldn't be doing such large projects as I was doing, and probably I should keep things a bit more contained. And for example, here in the frame, what I wanted to do is I wanted to try vegetation. But instead of going for a full-on forest, I went a bit safer, and you could see I did a couple of buildings and a couple of structures in the background. This is based on a concept, by the way. You can see the details on my ArtStation. Of a fantastic artist who did this. And what happened is, I think this is where I started finessing my approach of finding the right balance of how much learning curve you want to introduce in a personal piece. Because if you're making something that's completely something that you learn from scratch, you have not such a high chance to succeed, and you're also going to be demotivated by that, so you're not going to continue. Whereas if you make like 60-70% of a piece in a workforce that you already know how, and then you add 30% of something new that you learn, I think you're going to be more likely to finish that piece and finish your learning. So that's just an example of having a manageable scale. And back to less manageable scale. So this was an example of bad thing that I did. So this was right before my relocation. I decided to start yet another project. All of those 5-6 images that I've shown were in 2016. And I decided I'll do this one right before the relocation. Super easy. It wasn't super easy. I was stuck. I didn't know how to do. Again, you can see the details of the concept artist and some other stuff on my ArtStation. And I kind of put this project on hold when I was relocating, and I started working. But right before that, I thought, actually, no, I'm going to start another project at the same time. This was ArtStation Challenge. I started doing another character. I completely failed, and I withdrew from a challenge after a couple of weeks. Simply because I had no time and I couldn't deal with it. And I started working. So 2017, I relocated to UK. I brought with me only my laptop because I had an imposter syndrome, and I thought, after 6 months, I probably will be sent back home. So why invest? As I said, things turned out to be very different. So I'm still living in the same place I did, and I'm still living in UK. So I started working with Axis Studios. Fantastic people. We did a lot of projects. There was an amazing steady flow of projects into the studio. So within the first year, and some of those might not be in the same chronological order that they should be. I might be confusing years because the release is very different from the time that we worked on it usually. And this is something to keep in mind if you are starting in the industry and you want to maintain a portfolio for a couple of years. You might need to supplement it with personal projects, because sometimes when you work on something, it might not be released for the next couple of years, or it might not be released at all. So if you want to have some current updates of your latest skills, you should be having some personal work, I think. But again, it's a personal choice. So 2017, this was League of Legends, my first project with Axis Studios. After that, it was Crackdown 3. I did a couple of small things there. In here as well, I just did the wing and like some sculpting on the base structure. I didn't do any of the vines. And then I was gradually growing. So I think within the second year in Axis, I was already a senior artist within a couple of years in the industry. This was Destiny 2. It was Destiny 2 and Destiny 2 again. We had two different cutscenes. So I did some of upraising based on game environment in the first one, but on the second one, I did everything from scratch. I worked a bit on Kiss Me First, a series in the UK. I don't know if people watched it. I myself didn't. So more League of Legends, and this was, again, like I mentioned previously, this was a privilege to work on. We had a teaser and a trailer for The Elder Scrolls Online, which was super exciting to work on. It was a very big project for a small studio like Axis was at the time. Now Axis is a few times the size. So this was very exciting to work on. And at that year, I didn't do any personal projects. First of all, because I see comments regarding the environment, so that's very cool. And we're gonna come back to questions later. So in 2017, I didn't do any personal projects. I think I did maybe like a gun texturing exercise to slightly solidify my skills with Substance Painter. But it was not sustainable to do personal projects. And also at that time, because I was doing stuff that I always wanted to do during the day, and I was putting a lot of overtime, I didn't have a lot of time to actually do any other personal projects as well. In 2018, I did Days Gone, which was, I think, my favorite project with Axis Studios. I did a lot of vegetation on that, did some scattering and some scene dressing. This was one of my first projects where I started looking into scattering. And I think as an environment artist, this is a very important skill to have, because no matter what you're doing, you could always scatter stuff on top. And this could really elevate your environment, something that's people kind of afraid to start with, I think, but once they start and see that it's not so bad, they keep going. Outriders, we did a trailer for that. Towards the end of the project, and by this point I was already a senior artist, towards the end of the project, I think the lead artist left, and somehow I ended up leading the very final stage of the project, and that was 2018. Saints and Sinners, this was a VR game from Walking Dead, I believe, and I did a few environments on that. It was somewhat more stylized, and one of the things I like working in cinematic studio is that you get stylized projects, you get realistic projects, you get and realistic projects can really vary depending on their budget and the style. So it could be a lot of styles. And this also keeps the work a bit more sustainable, because I find that you work on something for a few years, you might sometimes be less excited with it, but when every month you get like a different challenge, different task, you kind of keep yourself fresh. Magic the Gathering. So I've done the bridge, so I didn't do the other stuff. And this was a game for Bethesda, I think. Deathloop. So it was an Edinburgh-inspired city. So it was really cool to work on, especially located in Scotland, because we could actually go to Edinburgh and shoot some reference. And I think this has taught me a lot, because the best reference you can have is holding something physically in your hand and being able to disassemble it and rotate it and understand how it works. Second best reference is the one that you shoot yourself. You might sometimes need a few visits, because I find that if you're doing something and you are shooting a reference first, you might miss the actual problematic areas, because it's the stuff you take for granted sometimes that is lost. So sometimes you have to revisit the set and shoot it again. But yeah, that was 2018. And in 2018, I went back to personal projects, but I scaled down a lot. And again, this is a motif that I'm going to come back to it repeatedly. You're going to see that I'm scaling up and scaling down depending on my bandwidth and the level of free time that I had. Yeah, couple of projects that I did. But again, you see very simple, well, relatively simple object or a prop that you can have a lot of reference of. This was in a local museum, so I could just go there and shoot it with my phone or with my camera. And then 2019, I was leading a bit more. So we had League of Legends. We had 5 of those trailers, short stories, and I was leading environments with a few talented people on my team for quite a while. We did one more Magic the Gathering that I worked on, and an Amazon game. And 2019, I was like, okay, I did some ice, I did some stuff. I can come back to that icy project that I left right before relocating a couple of years prior. So I've decided to break it down to smaller parts, and this is sometimes a good way to tackle a bigger project. And by the way, I still see a lot of questions, so we'll be coming back to those towards the end of the talk. So I'm not forgetting those. Regarding the environment, so if you have an environment that has a lot of elements in it, like for example, the one that I had, it had some ice and it had a ship, which by the way, ship. So if you have a ship and an ice and some trees and some other stuff, sometimes it's better to kind of break it down to smaller elements and create a personal project with each of those elements. Or like even if you're in a studio, right? So like probably a lot of people are going to be working on the same environment, so each is going to be allocated a different task. So for example, I started doing a ship, which was the most straightforward thing to me because it was just modeling. So I did that. And then I decided to do the trees because that was the most complex one and the one that I had no idea how to do it. So I did this to a satisfactory level, and I was like, okay, I can reuse those trees now for the next 10 years, and I will be using those. And another important aspect of it, which I didn't talk about yet, is social media. So back in college, my mentor told me that from 100% of time you spend on a project, maybe 20% of time you should spend on actually marketing and promoting yourself. And it's true, because if you do an amazing project that nobody knows, it's a bit of a shame, because also it gives you a nice motivation boost. that people actually like your stuff, and it's not just you being subjective and working on it for yourself. And again, it's very important to stay visible in the industry, just so you can get jobs in the future. So whenever you are working in environments, I feel that the challenge is that we need to cover a lot of ground and spend a lot of time on one piece. Like, for example, this could be 3 months, just me working on this environment, or maybe 1 month with other people in the studio. But we don't if we don't break it down to smaller parts and we don't promote ourselves, it's a bit of a waste, because if you're a character artist, you can do a turntable of a hand, you can do like sculpting, speed sculpting video, you could do a lot of stuff. If you're a prop artist, you just feature a small prop or a large prop. But when you're a when you're an environment artist and just those rocks on themselves, like I could have like a rock with a bird sitting on it, just like this, framed with like a nice close-up camera with like nice depth of field. This could be a personal project on itself. So a lot of the detail, a lot of work that we do kind of gets lost. So I think breaking your and splitting your stuff to lots of smaller projects kind of helps to mitigate that. And like I said, social media is important. And even besides all of those things that I mentioned, you get a lot of feedback and people help you improve, because the community is very good with this. So I highly recommend doing that. And at that point, also to kind of reuse the same project in different aspects a bit more, I started experimenting with trying different lightings, which first of all helps you as an artist because hey, you did this environment, it's PBR, right? But how do you know it's PBR? Because if you have like a very flattering lighting and you only worked on it in this shot, that's one thing. But if you change the lighting and suddenly nothing works, maybe it's not so PBR. So if you have shaders and you invest a lot of time into working on something, give it a few lighting scenarios, present it in a few different ways, and first of all, it's a good experiment as an artist, because then you can also see, oh, okay, as an environment artist, maybe now next time I have an environment that I know that is going to be overcast, I'm going to do A, B, C. But if I have a harsh light, maybe I'm going to use different values on my SSS. So that's one of the takeaways that was important for me from this personal project. And like I mentioned, because I was still breaking the big project into smaller pieces, I said, okay, so next thing that I need to be doing is making eyes. So my friend Enrico Cerbo, he had this amazing pack from Iceland of the photos he put on ArtStation. So I got the pack and I started making those things in ZBrush and used World Machine to create a couple of mountains. Now, actually, I think it's one single mountain that I just duplicated and rotated around. I think one of the important things as an environment artist is making sure you reuse your assets efficiently. Because instead of making 10 different mountains, which each is going to take gigabytes in memory with textures, you can just technically use one, because if I didn't say it, I bet nobody would notice that it's actually the same mountain, simply of the way it's rotated and tilted. And again, the same project, I did a few lighting scenarios. And one thing with social media is when you showcase a lot of things, or even the same thing but in different contexts, sometimes you throw stuff and something sticks. Maybe the first 5 posts you're gonna get 5 views, the next one is 100,000. So you never know. And again, because an environment artist, like I said, spends a lot of time on working on one single image that includes a lot of small things, just to keep up with the frequency of posting that you expect to be posting on Instagram, either you post the same image every day or you just post maybe this piece of ice, maybe your sculpting workflow on this one, maybe this thing, maybe the way you achieve this underwater icy thing underneath. So all of those things are very important to think about. And I finally came back to this project equipped with all the tools. I did some scans. I did some stuff. I finally finessed my speed tree workflow. I managed to create good looking icy trees. And as I was about, I don't know, 50-60% done with this project, I lost my hard drive with everything on it. So backups, keep backups, because this happens, and it's a shame because a lot of those things I could be reusing for the next few personal projects, and also, you know, some of the assets that you create, you can put them on sale on Marketplace, and it could earn a couple of extra dollars a month, which is not much, but it's something. It buys you a coffee. So it's a shame that I lost it, but never finished it. And again, this is one of the projects that has taught me the most, but it's also the one that was too big for me until a certain point. So I think the lesson here is when you are starting to work on something as a personal project and it's too big for you, it's okay to start a new one if you're gonna revisit and you're gonna finish this one, but be very picky with the choice of your projects before you do start them, because if you start something that's too big and you're never gonna finish it, it's gonna demotivate you and you're gonna miss a piece of your portfolio. So it's a shame. 2020 and 2021. So this was my final years in Axis Studios, but it was also in a way me closing a circle, because before I joined, the things that impressed me the most in 2017 was the trailer of Dead Island, of that guy running and slowly becoming a zombie and falling apart. So I got to work on Dead Island too. And another thing which always impressed me about Axis Studios was their work on Halo. So I got to work on not one, but two Halo Infinite cinematics. And I somehow kept this in here. Shouldn't be here. This was from the previous year. Another Magic the Gathering, one with vampires, one with werewolves. Love, Death and Robots, which aired and came out at the time, and Scrooge, which was the Netflix movie that Axis did. So I did the house, I didn't do the texturing, and I also did the model, but not the texturing on here. And on Love, Death and Robots, we were scattering the grass manually. So I think in every shot I had moved a few blades of grass, specific blades of grass by hand. So this was a lot of work. But that was the end of my career in cinematics, because moving on, I went to MPC and I went to Goodbye Kansas, who are doing cinematics as well, but the work is almost equally split between cinematics, movies, and TV series, which is another cool thing that I didn't get to work on before, and I'm very thankful that I did now. And at that time, I also thought to myself, I'm gonna do more Edinburgh styled projects, and I started this, never finished it, and also because I was really burnt out, and I tried to make it for ArtStation Marketplace. I think the important distinction here is if you are deciding to work on something full time, right? Like if you take full time and you say, okay, I'm gonna make packs and I'm gonna sell assets, you will be able to follow tools simply because that's your goal now. But if you're trying to achieve too many goals, like if you're trying to create assets for sale, but now you're also trying to use them as personal projects, maybe it's not the most sustainable way of achieving it. I think the more sustainable way would be just creating a personal project and then selectively, right? Like if I created this building in high resolution, this one in high, this one in medium, this one in low resolution, because it's so far away, so I don't invest as much time in it. Maybe I could sell the couple of closer buildings at higher price, maybe the one further. But again, like the point is, once you start mixing personal projects with money and you start kind of trying to have it as a second job almost, doesn't always work together with your first job, and it's not very sustainable. So think about it. Again, personal projects, like I said, can be hit or miss because they can burn you out more than any of your professional work. So the way I think to keep it sustainable is working on subject matters that keep you excited, or things that you see every day and you can easily recreate. And the important thing is just focusing on yourself, because I think one of the important things that happened in 2020 is with the lockdown. I think there was a big shift in my mindset because everybody realized what an important aspect of physical and mental health that basically we were neglecting before. Because I think during lockdown, people started running, people started exercising, people started doing different things, which they weren't doing before. And it's not that our life was very different, because when I was working from home in lockdown, the only difference in physical exercise that I was doing is that when I was working in the studio, I would walk 50 meters, literally 50, 60 meters to the studio and take a lift and sit at my desk. And then maybe at lunchtime, I would go, 100 meters and get me some food. Whereas when I was working from home, I was just walking from my fridge to my computer, which again, like on grand scale of things, it's not such a big of a difference. But because it was so extreme, I think I started understanding how important it is to exercise and go out and go on walks, both for your mental health and physical. Because otherwise, I think if you are spending 8 hours in front of the computer and then the only thing you're doing in the evening is just watching TV afterwards, I think you're gonna feel quite bad after a few years. And but that's personally me. I think that going out and exploring helps you to be a bit more motivated with working with computers. But anyway, so 2021, I started an MPC right after Axis Studios, and I worked on Disenchanted and some other project that is not out yet. And again, it brings me back to the point of the importance of keeping your portfolio maintained all the time and supplemented with some other stuff than professional work, because I've had friends working on Spaceman in 2021 and probably even prior to that, and it only came out this year. And I've been working on a few projects in other studios that never seen the light of day. So if you're expecting to have your professional portfolio to be able to showcase all of your work that you've done in the studio, sometimes life has other plans. So in 2022, I've worked on Disenchanted. I worked on A Man Called Otto. A Man Called Otto was in Goodbye, Kansas. So in end of 2022, I was in Goodbye, Kansas. And 2023, I was mostly working on series. With the exception of a couple of cinematics, I've worked on One Piece. I was a lead on that for a while. We did a few episodes. I've worked on Night Country True Detective. I did some character work on that, simply because about that time I started embracing a bit more my generalist side. And I think this is an interesting shift in the industry, because in the beginning when I started, everybody was telling me that you know the saying, jack of all trades, master of none. If you're doing and you're spreading yourself so thin and you're doing too much, you're not gonna master anything. But I think over time you can master things. So it's important to just prioritize the skills that you want to acquire first. And it's okay to be working on other things. I think long term, this might help you survive the industry, especially when you have things like strikes or maybe layoffs that you maybe heard in some other companies. So if you, the more skills you have, the more useful you are to the studio. Um, the easier it is for you to stay employed and get new jobs. And I think that in general, people with good skills and good personal skills as well, they're not gonna struggle to find a new job, even when there is a bit of a bad time in the industry. So this was me working on just some character work and doing some per shot sculpting and fixing the animation. So out of my comfort zone, but I think it was a really cool project for me to work on. Shogun, whoever is not watching it, I highly recommend it. It's out now. I still cannot really talk about what we did because it's not out yet, the episodes that we worked on, but I highly recommend watching it, and it was really cool. And the last thing I did in 2023 was, besides working some freelance for Platige and starting a mentorship in Think Tank, I also did this Gnomon workshop. So I'm gonna present it now. Oh, before that, I also did a couple of personal projects, but I never actually bothered to finish them to a degree of finish that I used to do with my other ones. I kept them in a bit of a concept phase. And I downloaded this time a couple of assets, such as those boats from Sketchfab. Everything else is just scans and assets that I did. And here is the stuff I worked on for Gnomon. So, Case, would you like to show the promo?
Yeah, we can go through it now because I know you're gonna kind of walk us through some awesome stuff.
I
So
don't think
let's
I can hear you.
oh, give me one to get hello, hi. I think we can run the promo now. Ninja Mod, how
Hello and welcome to this Gnomon Workshop. My name is Dmitry Kremiansky and I'm a lead environment artist with over 8 years of experience in the industry, including half a dozen movies and TV shows and over 40 trailers and cinematics. In this workshop we're gonna explore the entire environment pipeline for VFX and cinematics with focus on modeling and texturing in Maya and Substance Painter. We're gonna start with guiding principles to reference gathering and finish with the look development and render of the scene. If you are looking to improve your modeling and texturing, I hope this workshop is for you.
exciting. I think I enjoy looking at that trailer just because I know we got a little insight on it yesterday on everything that you're gonna kind of present to us and show us a little demo of. So I'm super excited about it.
Yep, thank you. So I guess I could start with a little demo. And by the way, my speakers were off, so if you were asking or saying something in between, I can hear you now. So I will do this. I was asking on my Instagram channel regarding what prop people would like me to see at Esho. It was pretty much an even split between a fraction of a building and this metal crane, but simply because my workshop kind of covers how to create a building, instead I'm gonna do this. And let's start. So the moment you have a model like this, which I could show you in Maya, I tend to not go too high poly or too low poly, but what I do tend to do is I tend to bevel every edge. I don't work with subdivisions, simply because it's a bit lighter in the viewport, and also I just don't think that props that are seen from this distance from the camera, they should have too many polygons anyway. And I tend to put them where they matter, where they change the silhouette. So again, you can see there are bevels on everything. So everything has soft normals. And I'll start with Substance Painter. So I'm using a slightly older Substance Painter version, but it's still the same approaches that you can use in the new one. If anything, it's much simpler in the new one. And the first thing I want to do is I will just start with a base layer. And the base layer would be not the base layer in physical life. So I wouldn't start with the metal. Instead, I would start with just the paint, because what I want to achieve is when you work in the studio, right? You need to work with iterations. You need to create something progressively that is looking better. And if you squint and you look at it like this, you should be able to kind of look and see the final result that you should be aiming for. So if you start with metal, not the best approach. I would start with paint or stuff that you see the most from far away. So I will start with paint, and I will just add some roughness. I will look at something that's slightly rounded so I can kind of eyeball the highlight. I recommend you work with reference. I have some references on the other monitor, so always work with the reference. And if you have a painterly concept, try and find something that matches whatever you're doing in real life, because otherwise you're just gonna create something that doesn't look quite right. And instead of trying and create a fill layer with roughness grunge, what I could do, I would just create a fill layer inside this fill layer with just roughness. And I could maybe introduce those scratches, and I would tile them, let's say 5 times. And just so I don't see the repetition as much next to each other, I would rotate it, I don't know, 17 degrees. Now suddenly you see it doesn't look as tileable as it looked before, because now you could clearly see the repetition. And I would set the roughness here to soft light. So overall, if I'm switching to roughness, I'm maintaining more or less the same value now as I used to have, which is important. And now I'm just adding some breakup to it. So you can see when I move the camera around, there's some highlights hitting it a bit differently. And maybe I could plug the same thing also in the height on very low opacity. So I'm gonna switch to height, and I'm gonna keep it 1. Now, what happens when you put something on 1, which is the lowest you can put, and you still get something that is quite too distressed and too damaged? You can create another fill inside the same fill layer, set the height to normal, and let's say reduce it like this. So now basically it overrides and it brings back the height to what it used to be. And we have something like this, which is cool. And again, you can start with smart layer. If you have your own smart layers, amazing. You can start with the ones that you have built in here. So we could try and look for painted stuff, but let's see how it looks. But I don't think the result that we're going to achieve is going to be just as good, because looking at this, I think that this looks a bit more like a toy. And again, this is all Substance Painter. The newer materials are a bit better. But I would always try and create something by myself so I control everything. What I could do, however, I could maybe reuse some of it. So I'm just going to grab the rust, dust, and the halo from this guy. I'm going to delete the green base. Actually, maybe I like the green color. Maybe I'll make it green. Just so we see the rust a bit better. And you can see that the rust is a bit too prominent. So I'm gonna just start introducing them one by one. So first level, Rusty Halo. What it does, I'll alt and click on the mask. It just looks at the ambient occlusion, I think, and blurs it a bit. One thing to keep in mind is that when you blur things and you have UV seams, it doesn't work well together. You're going to create a very harsh and visible seam. And if you have ambient occlusion building up in those cogs, I think it's important that you either bake them separately or you tweak them up and you re-import it into Substance Painter, because otherwise you're going to have baked in areas where you have more stuff where they are in close proximity to each other, and you have less detail as they are further apart. And if this thing is supposed to be animated and to be rotated, it's not going to look good. So keep that in mind. So instead of this, I'll just use I'll replace the generator with dirt. Let's see how that looks. And I think that doesn't look good by default at all. Simply because the dirt is creating those consistent lines. The generators in Substance Painter, whether dirt or Metal Edgeware, they tend to create very consistent, very harsh lines of detail. And especially if you have something that is cylindrical or circular, you're just gonna have details everywhere there. So for example, you would expect this to be not as damaged and not as rusty, but this is what you get from a generator. So I'll go back. I will use the dirt generator. And by the way, I'll just jump back a bit. If you did use the mask editor, because actually it gives us somewhat of a better result, and you had those issues with the UV seams, what you could do, you could always create a generator on top and use the UV border distance to kind of remove any detail from the seams. So at the moment, sure, it's removing all of the stuff that was building up. I could also be adding it instead. So you are creating consistent detail on all the seams instead, which might not be what you're looking for, but it's better sometimes than having those harsh transitions of a lot of detail next to no detail at all. So let's say maybe I'll keep it like this. And maybe I would reduce the base color. And sometimes when you get a level like this, which kind of looks cool, but you don't know what to do with it, I recommend you flick between the different modes and you will see what it gives you. So I think something like this on low opacity kind of looks cool, and it doesn't hurt because it creates some sort of like areas where it's less green and more red. But I think the tiling could be a bit more, so I'm gonna tile it a bit more, and I'm gonna rotate it, random number, simply so, like I said, we don't see the repetition as much. And if I wanted to break up a bit this sort of uniform edges, what I could create a fill, and I could create galvanic on top, and I could set it to soft light. And again, this introduces back the same issue we had before, because the UV seams are in places that are not convenient for us. Sometimes some of it can be solved with triplanar projection. Sometimes it makes it a bit harder. So the main takeaway here is try and cut your UVs in a way that works for you, and try to have as few UV islands as possible if you work in VFX. If you work in video games, you have different restrictions, so it's very different. But still, fewer UV sims generally tend to create fewer problems. But I think, because I don't mind necessarily this having more detail than this side of the cog, because that thing is more worn out as they come in contact with each other, I'll keep it as is. The rust level by itself is not looking good. So let's take a look at how it looks by default. I don't think it looks good, but lucky for us, I know that if we go to materials and we look for rust, I think rust cores is actually looking quite good, especially when scaled down a bit. I'm going to set the height to normal. It's important sometimes to go through your different channels, because if you start adding levels with different blending modes, you're going to start having inconsistent height across models or across the same model. So for example, you could have this cog really inset compared to the height of the overall object, but because it's not displacing it in the viewport, you wouldn't know. But once you start using displacement in V-Ray or Arnold or Blender, what's going to happen is some of the stuff is going to go inwards, but some of the stuff is going to bulge out, and you're going to have a weird looking model. So let's say we have something like this, but I think still the height of the rust is too prominent. So I'm going to reduce the intensity to 0.5 and 0.02. And I think that's more like it. Now, one thing that works with noisy textures particularly well is adding a filter that sharpens it a bit, and it really brings more of the detail back in. So here we are looking at the rust without sharpen. With a tiny bit of sharpen, you can see how each individual bit of rust pops, maybe a bit too much. We don't want it to flicker and alias, so I think this is good. Now, before we had the damaged rust, but it was not looking good. Now let's see what happens now if we create a mask and we create a generator and we add metal edge well, and let's see how it looks. So first of all, I think the rust at the moment is supposed to be inset. Now, should I make this layer of the paint bulge outwards by moving the height outward? Maybe, but I would try and make sure that overall, when you squint and everything is looking blurry, or you just put a blur on top, that the average height would be what it should be, which in this case is 0. So I'm going to put 0.01. And in here, in the rust cores, which seem to be 0.5, we could offset this inward by maybe saying if we can go to negative values, which for some reason they work in here like this, but something like this should work. Maybe it's too much. But the thing that I mentioned before is we're getting a lot of consistent rust everywhere, which I don't like. So what I would do, I would just always, whenever I use a generator, I would try to break it up with something. So I will create a fill and I would add shavings, which is a grunge built in Substance Painter, and I would set this to multiply. So basically at the moment you see there's a lot of white dots here and there, and underneath it we have all the underlying detail. So what I will do, I'll just set it to multiply, and let's take a look at how it looks. And now we have the damages, which are now looking more like somebody accidentally was working with something or hit it with a hammer or something like this, or something heavy that was swinging on the chain hit the crane. And we are getting some of it just where we should be getting it. And I think at the moment it looks a bit too uniform. So what we could do, we could add a generator on top, a filter, which is called blur slope, to break it up a bit. I think the effect by default is too strong. So a few ways to go about it. You could reduce the tiling, you could increase the blur, or you could reduce the intensity, or the combination of all three. So I'll do lesser intensity. Let's see how this looks. Before and after, you can see it's broken up a bit, but now I'm getting a lot of gray area. Now, in real life, things don't tend to be 50% opacity, so I don't imagine this paint would be 50% opaque. So I'll just take levels and I will clump it like this. And now we are getting a much harsher line, and it looks a bit more like a peeling rust. And we are starting to get a lot of happy accidents here. And again, as an environment artist, I am not working in UDIMs for this demo. This is just one single UDIM. This is one single 4K map. This is how the UVs look like. Could have been more optimized, but I think it's still not bad. Now, a couple of things here. So I think once you texture something like this, if you are working with, I don't know, 20 UDIMs, you're gonna slow yourself down. So really try and find a good resolution that works for you, but don't overkill it. And I think having nice and optimized UVs that are stuck together, sometimes a bit manually, could go a long way, because I've seen people texturing a pop like this with 10 UDIMs. Sure, if you have some, I don't know, Ant-Man figure running on top of this, this is what's required. But I think for something that maybe would be seen like this on the screen, and let's say it's full HD, so 1080p, so maybe 4K should be enough. Again, depending on how much overlapping UVs and other factors that you have, but let's say roughly speaking, if we see each side is getting 2K, and some other sides underneath and between the other things that we don't see as much getting 2K as well, it's fine. So we have something like this, and as an environment artist, because we need to create a lot of things, and usually I wouldn't be working on just one crane. I would probably be assigned a crane, a lamp, and some other things, and we would be sharing substance material between us. If you want to create a piece that stands out for your portfolio, maybe sometimes the right way is just to add paint and start manually adding paint and start projecting textures. That's a valid approach, but whenever you create something for environments, you simply don't have time in most of the cases. So what I will do, I will just add as much as you can procedurally, and only stuff that stands out in a bad way I would remove, and I would paint it out, and maybe I would even mark the layer red, so you know next time you apply it to another model, you need to repaint it on that model as well. Or I will just try and keep everything procedural within reason, and you can have a lot of those happy accidents and stuff happening if you just rotate sometimes the texture just in a different angle, and you might get a result that you're looking for without even having to manually paint. So we have this rust, we have this thing. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to use some anchor points, which is one of my favorite tricks. And what they do is basically they create a sample, right? So from looking at this mask, we have here a black and white mask. I'm gonna create here anchor point, which is now gonna sample everything underneath the anchor point. Now, for example, what I could do, I could create, I don't know, I could blur this mask, right? But anything that modifies the mask or anything that modifies after the anchor point is not gonna be sampled. So this is something to keep in mind. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Sometimes you could say, actually, instead of creating, like, I like this rust, but I also want to have rust hero or something. maybe I want to have some scratches. And maybe it doesn't quite work out adding it with blending modes. So what I could do, I could create a fill. I could completely kill everything that I've built in this mask so far, but I'm still sampling it because me removing this detail is not being read by the anchor point. And now what I could do, I could say, actually on top, I will add maybe some wipes, maybe, I don't know, something like this. Maybe there are some scratches on this crane somewhere. Something like this. And then maybe 2 times. So maybe those scratches are like them, but now I want to bring back the other detail. And let's say I tweak a bit with levels. Now, if I was tweaking it without the anchor point, what would happen is these levels would affect everything, right? So if I set this to add, you will see that my levels would work, or maybe I add a blur slope. So now this blur slope is also blurring the other detail that I added earlier, and I'm already blur sloping it. I don't want it to be affected. So this anchor point and this remove detail is now preserving it in the original state, and I could create a fill layer with the same thing, the anchor point that I've sampled before as it is, without any additional stuff on top, and I could reintroduce it back. And you could see, like, sometimes you get like happy accidents of stuff aligning, like, oh, you have like a damage here and a scratch coming out of it. So play with those things and see what works for you best. And sometimes you could create another duplicate of this rust and create those scratches by themselves. But if I'm happy with a certain stage in my mask and I want to keep it, I create an anchor point, I put a blank black level layer on top, I work on it again, I introduce more stuff, and I bring it back. So we have this, we have the anchor point. Let's say we want to have the paint bulging a bit on top of some of those things, right? So usually we have some of the paint kind of like bloated around the damaged area. So how do we do this? So let's say I'm gonna use the fill and I'm gonna use the anchor point, which is this thing. And important thing to remember about masks is you can barely manipulate the black and white, but what you need to create is you need to create some like gray range that you can overlay and play around with. So I'm gonna add blur. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna add the same mask again. If you're using a substance matter, you could just right click and duplicate. And I'm gonna subtract it. Now, what this did is basically I'm bringing the mask, I'm blurring it, which expands it because it creates an average with the neighboring pixels, and I'm removing it from itself. And what it does, it gives me this effect. But I think a lot of people leave it as is. At this point, what I would recommend is don't have it just like this. So if you have paint slightly inflated around the damaged areas, it wouldn't be as uniform. So what I would do, I would add a filter blur slope. I would add it before I'm subtracting the mask. And now you could see it's bulging in some sort of non-uniform way. You can see there's like different, I'm gonna set the base color to overlay to make it a bit brighter and a bit more reddish. I'm gonna make it more rough and I'm gonna make it a bit more pronounced. So you can see now it creates some sort of breakup around the edge instead of just having this uniform highlight, which looks very CG. And one thing to keep in mind is like, hey, we have the damaged areas and we have the paint inflated around them, but we also should have paint inflated. My speaker is off again. we should have the paint inflated around different areas as well, where it didn't get damaged just yet. So I'm gonna create a fill, and I'm gonna bring back shavings. I'm gonna tile them 4 times. I'm gonna set them to add, and maybe I'm gonna put them before blur slope. Let's see what it gives, maybe 2. And you can see now you start getting paint that is kind of like bulging but not damaged here, and in other areas as well. And maybe, because this is quite big, maybe I want to add some more of it. So, but I want, or maybe I want to introduce more details to those. What I do, I will create another anchor point. And at this point, I would be better off if I was naming them. So I will call it inflated paint. And I will create a fill layer. I'm gonna have some height in it. I don't know what it will be yet, but we're gonna figure it out in a second. Black mask, fill, inflated paint. And we are getting this in here. And maybe in here I would put Berlin noise. Now, Berlin noise by default is just wavy. So what I will do, I'll just filter and blur slope it a bit. And I'm gonna blur the blur slope. It makes it a bit less noisy. I'm gonna reduce the amount of it. So you can see it's slightly more broken up a bit. And I'm gonna set this to 1. Maybe 5, maybe 10. Maybe 15, yeah. Now, the reason I'm doing it is because otherwise you're getting this perfectly rounded shape. So now it's kind of like a bit more wonky and funny. Maybe even more, 25. Maybe higher frequency even. And something like this. We could also use in here, I'm gonna create another fill with maybe another noise, maybe Berlin, contrast, balance, 3, 9. I'm just gonna set this to 1 and set this to add maybe 5. Okay, so now we have just a bit of damage or maybe paint splotches and build-up cells, something like this. And the important thing is like thinking of the details and working on the stuff, prioritizing it from the distance, right? So first we work on the big layer, which is the paint. Then we work on the rust that we see. And something that comes on top of all of it, and I put before and I didn't address it yet, is the dust. So let's bring it back to the top and let's take a look at the mask. So by default, the dust that came from that material that I used is not so bad. It's just using some noise and using a gradient and a sharpen. And without the sharpen, you could see it's looking very soft. But I think the mask could use some love. So instead of mask editor, I'll just start with the generator. I'll delete the other one. I'll start with, sometimes it's nice to start with light and use 270 because this basically gives you the top facing surface and basically one of the things to keep in mind here is light would work really nicely with blur, because that would help you expand something. Because, like, for example, this is up-facing surface, but really what you would also have is you would have some leaks coming down, flowing down with the water. So you would want to use blur. But bear in mind what I said before, it might not work well with UV scenes. So especially stuff like this might be a bit funny. And when you're using dust, keep in mind that surfaces that are often being used, like for example, those wheels and cogs, they would not necessarily be getting as much dust simply because they're used. So you might want to manually remove those dust layers from those things, and you need to paint it out. But I think if we're working on a prop that has been standing there for a while, we can do it as is. So I think by default, this dust is too intense, right? So what we could do is we could actually look at the layer itself, at the color, and what I would like to do is I will take an anchor point from the color and I will use it to actually mask. Now, why I want this? Because you see there's a lot of frequency and a lot of detail in here already. So what I could be what I could be doing is using it to my benefit, and I could sample some of this detail and introduce it back to the mask. Now remember, if I'm setting it to overlay or soft light, if the mask is either black or white, it's not changing a lot. So I'm gonna remove the light attenuation that comes in by default. So you can see at the top it's very white, so it's not gonna be influenced. At the perpendicular sides that are facing us at the moment, it's nearly black, so we're not gonna get any of that anyway, so it doesn't matter. But on this transition that we have here, where it's kind of a grayscale, this is where it's gonna make the most impact. So I'm gonna create this fill, anchor point, dust. And you see, I've sampled the color and I brought the color, which was masked, but it still sampled the whole color from the whole layer into here. I'm gonna set this to overlay. And you can see now it corresponds to the actual, and I think it's a bit too bright. So I'm just gonna make it down. I mean, really I should be using some photo texture, but just for the sake of demonstration, I think this kind of works, right? So still too prominent, height 5. Always look at the reference and like don't overdo dust layers. And still there's a lot of it, and I'm gonna remove a lot of it back, but you can see now that I'm overlaying it, I have it like this. Now, anchor point, the moment you bring it in back, it has the option to use the levels. It can also be, you can also use just the green, blue, and green colors, which are particularly useful if you're referencing a normal map. Because then you can be using a certain channel, right? So for example, if you have a wall and you're using a normal map on the wall and you have the bricks, and each individual brick has the green with the OpenGL map where the top of the brick is, you could now sample the green color from the sampled normal map from the brick, and you could have dust building up just on top of the brick and using just texture without having to bake it into anything else. Now, instead of using those levels, I'll tend to create levels on top and tweak them, because sometimes when you copy it across different models, it kind of breaks whatever you're sampling here. So I always try to have as many layers as I can with things broken up like this. So let's say something like this. And this is starting to look like something, but it's still very uniform and flat at the top. So I will create a fill. And this time I'm going to go to textures and see what textures of leaks I have, if at all. So I have this tileable of droplets. I have no idea how it looks like. Let's take a look. Maybe tile it a few times. Maybe 3 times. And especially when it comes to any leaking or anything else, I recommend you use photo textures and not procedurally generated or leak brushes or anything of the sort, because the detail that you get here is much better. So I think by default with the most of my UVs, this is kind of like skewed sideways. So I'm just gonna rotate it 90 degrees. This is it works here, it works here. If it works on the majority of the large surfaces, it's okay. Like for example here, you don't really necessarily see that it's a bit tilted towards the side. And I'm gonna set this to multiply. And what we have here now is this, and this is starting to look like something. What we could also do, we could remember the mask damage. We could bring it here as well. We could take the rust, and we could remove it from the mask. So wherever we have rust, we don't have as much dust because maybe it was freshly damaged. And I think still it kind of is very uniform. So I would somewhere in between, I'm gonna create a fill. I'm gonna create, I'm just gonna hit 0 and see what default substance painter branches are there. This one, let's duplicate it 4 times. Multiply. Something like this. Now, we could repeat the steps, or we could even add it to the sides as well. I think the sides could also use a lot of leaks and damage. But I think this is something. Now, somewhere in between all of this, what I want to do also is, let's say I decided I want to create a layer of underpaint. So I want maybe this grain to have some sort of like darker primer that is visible in some places. So again, black mask and fill. Let's start with shavings. I think it should say texture and then shavings. I could just go into, I think it's in, yeah. So I'm gonna use this shavings again and again. I use only maybe 5 or 6 procedural branches in Substance Painter. I don't try and utilize all of them. It's not a competition. I use dirt. I use galvanic textures that are really good for adding some variation. And I'm using shavings for sort of small details. So let's say we have something like this at levels, because remember we said we don't want gray areas. I'm gonna clump it. Something like this. Let's say the primer is a bit inset, right? So inset. Let's say it's a bit rough. Something like this. And let's say this. We don't like this. Let's say we're gonna add a del slope. And let's say I think I need to rotate the shavings a bit more so they don't match the other one. So let's say I'm not in love with the shapes we're getting, so I'm gonna try and add something else. So I'm just gonna go to granges, and I could experiment with random granges. What I'm looking for is something that has a lot of contrast and not necessarily a lot of noise, because something like this. Let's say if I invert it and I reduce it, maybe this is what we want. Now, let's say that this gives you the right result, which at the moment it's not quite. And one of the things that I don't like about it is we have a lot of visual noise. especially here. One of the ways to eliminate this noise, so this is how it looks by default. One of the ways to eliminate noise, if you are creating those like patches all over the model, that you are kind of overall happy with their size and shape, but not necessarily are good. So I will add a filter that's called blur, 0.2. And you see the blur, what it does, it almost eliminates the smaller frequency noise. And I'm going to create levels. Sorry, levels. And I'm going to make it darker and brighter here. So what that did, you see, I'm going to pull it down and pull this one down as well. So what I did effectively, I just killed all the smaller frequency noise by blurring it, so now it becomes gray instead of white, and now I also clumped it, so everything that was gray now became black. And now I lost some detail, right? So this is where the blur slope comes back into play. It breaks the edge a bit more. And let's say maybe we add this one here. Something like this. Maybe we wanted to be inset half of this. And sometimes when you work on something like this, you kind of realize, oh, okay, maybe it would be good that this layer that I added would have been influencing something else as well. So I'm gonna bring it down now. And it's nice to have your layers, or at least the majority of them, to be named. So I'm going to call this primer. Otherwise, you're going to be looking at layer 2, layer 3, and you're not going to be able to understand what you're doing. And I'm going to create an anchor point. And what I'm thinking about is, and this is paint bulging. Maybe I use the same layer also in the paint bulging. Maybe I wanted to primer mask. Add it before the blur and everything else. So maybe I want it to be also where the paint is bulging, and you can see this is where stuff starts to break a bit. But remember that we need to add it twice. First, before we manipulate it and expand it, and second, when we remove it. So I'm gonna fill again and primer, and I'm gonna subtract it. Here. And let's say maybe I don't want it to be as intense as the bulging on the rust, because this is where it's really starting to peel off. So I'm just going to reduce the opacity of this before I'm adding it. You can see this is where I'm adding it. So instead of 100%, which makes it super white, I'll just give it maybe 10%. And it's also important because the shape of this noise is just as big, if not larger, than the majority of the rust. So when you're blurring it, you're expanding it even more. So you're essentially getting a lot of detail that you don't want. And you can see there's still a lot of noise here I don't like. So I could go back to the primer and I could look at the blur, 0.4. And you can see the blur kind of just kills the details, which we can then reintroduce with the blur slope. So something like this. We could use another blur slope, by the way. Sometimes it's useful to create a big detail and then to create a smaller detail by using maybe more intensity, more tiling, contrast. Something like this. And remember to put it back before the mask thing. So yeah, we are getting this, which is starting to look cool. I think maybe the primer could be a bit darker. Maybe the height of it could be not as visible, and maybe on the paint pouching, you could name this primer. Maybe it could be half, even less, just so it's not as visible. It's already visible in the roughness layer. I think it will be recorded. Chris, is it going to be recorded? I see a question of people asking if it's going to be recorded.
Yes, this will be stored on our YouTube and our Twitch.
Perfect, thank you so much. All right, and again, going back and forth, I think now we have the basic blocks of what we want. So maybe we start introducing more interesting stuff, such as I'm gonna go back to the very beginning and I'm gonna say, hey, what improves readability often is when you have some sort of gradient on the entire thing. So why don't we just add a color gradient, which is gonna be a projection from the side. And by the way, if you ever want to randomize color in different pieces, sometimes all it takes is just, if you have them carefully cut on different UV islands and you just put a UV projection with a gradient, you will see suddenly, like maybe let's say gradient that goes black, white, black, instead of just black, black to white. You can see now suddenly every piece has a different value, which might not what you want it to be, but back to the topic of creating a gradient on everything, I'll just set this to panel projection, scale it down a bit, maybe set this to soft light in height, and now you can see it's slightly darker towards the top, slightly maybe sunburned towards the top. So something like this, you need to be careful when you're starting to add overlays and soft lights, because in the end, even if you start with PBR values, eventually you might end up with here something looking quite dark. So one way to eliminate it, you could create a fill layer with pass-through, which essentially clumps everything underneath it. So you could call it sampler. And add an anchor point. We're gonna use it later, but I'm gonna, regardless of the anchor point, I'm gonna add filter gradient. And I could say this is gonna be red, color to position, and I could say everything higher than this value is this, everything that 4 colors. So red, so green, and then this one green. And so what I'm creating is basically I'm creating a gradient. So let's say everything that is under 0.1 value is going to be red. Everything above 0.9 value is going to be red, which means that like everything in the extreme 10% and the lower 10% is not is red. So at the moment I'm looking at this, I'm safe. I think maybe if I was like a bit on the safer side, let's see. So you can see my values are somewhat darker. So like you can see where I'm starting to hit 0.2, which is a bit dark. I'm starting to get things that are not, that basically this flags to me that I need to change the values. I'm gonna hide this. I'm gonna call this, it's called sampler anchor point, but I'm gonna rename it to validator. Validator. And the cool thing about the sampler, right? So let's say we were adding layers and we were adding, and somewhere along the way, we kind of forgot to balance the roughness. And in a lot of the scans and textures, the roughness is derived from the color anyway. So we could create a fill with the roughness. We're gonna plug this anchor point, which is called sampler, which we are sampling everything beneath that in base color. We're gonna check that the reference channel is base color, and I'm gonna switch to roughness, and you can see now levels that I'm actually using the base color inside roughness as well. I could invert it, I could play with it, I could maybe set it to different blending mode and kind of split the difference and use it to tweak a bit the underlaying layers before, but this is what we have. Maybe one thing I would also like to have is maybe some sort of brush strokes. So I'm just gonna create the layer with height. And again, this is like where you see I'm starting to finesse stuff a bit. I'm gonna call this brush stroke and black mask. And as you see, I didn't do any paint at all. I didn't even select stuff for the mask. Again, in this case, it was a bit specific, so I didn't need to isolate materials, but I'm trying to do the base first. So I'm going to create a fill, wipes. I find that wipe, maybe this one.
Dmitry, I was thinking while you're patching up the rest of this, which by the way looks amazing, maybe I can throw some questions at you that we've had been coming through the chat during our stream.
That would be amazing because I'm not particularly good with multitasking, so looking at the monitor and answering questions, so something like that. Yeah.
Well, so okay, so we're looking at you working on this right now, and Diego House asks, when you create a concept, do you create it on paper, or do you just go to 3D models, or do you use references primarily? Like, kind of, what's your workflow when you're thinking up a concept and executing it?
It's a good question. I think it depends, right? Like I'm not particularly good with Photoshop, so if I had an idea in my mind, I would actually probably grab a piece of physical paper and sketch it. But because after I sketch it, I kind of need to go and I need to find the photo reference anyway. My advice is like to start maybe like gathering the photos and like putting them together. It's true that sometimes when you create a sketch or you have some idea in your mind, you will find a reference that matches it. So it's just important to kind of make sure that whatever photos you're using as a reference to kind of base your concepts and to ground your concept in, is to make sure that they're grounded and not very specific, like they don't look weird to a general person looking at them.
Yeah, you had mentioned that some of the stuff that you were designing were photographs that your friend took when they were on a trip. That
Yes.
was so just really grounded in reality. Well, then in that same realm of designing and doing environments, Anamea, I'm going to try and get all these names right, so everyone. Anamea says, when doing environments, should you aim to do everything yourself? Or is it okay to use assets from something like Kitbash, for instance?
In this context, it's important to see what are you aiming for? Because if you're a lighting artist, I would say you should definitely get somebody else's assets and you shine, no pun intended, your lighting scene, like where what you're supposed to be doing. Because if you spend time modeling, which is not your discipline, and then you have assets that maybe are not looking as amazing as they could, and then you put the best lighting ever, still people are going to be distracted by the quality. So I think in this context, it's okay to download. And I think if you have enough hero assets that are looking amazing, that prove that you are able to create something and from scratch to create it yourself, and then you maybe have a couple of downloaded buckets and a couple of sucks that take 10 minutes to make, nobody's going to doubt your ability. It is like, again, like it's a very tricky question depending on who is going to be reviewing the portfolio and what they expect. So I generally tend to create as much as I can by myself. But I think smaller things, or like things that and it's important to mention what you downloaded, right? Because if there is like a very obvious Megascan asset that everybody knows it's a Megascan, but you say you did everything from scratch, people are going to know. So it's important to say, hey, I modeled this and I used a couple of assets to enhance the scene, right? Like if you're modeling an amazing, I don't know, like weapon, like armory and a few weapons, and everything is modeled really well, and you used a couple of textures for like the walls, and you downloaded the model of the rock, it's okay.
So then in that, as you were saying, like, you know, explaining what you're using, kind of showing your work, that could lead us into this next question by Christine Escobedo. In your reel, what should you highlight to make you stand out as a junior artist? So you were saying, you know, these are the things that you should say that you used if you're, you know, aiming for this. But just as any general tips for junior artists out there that are trying to break in on things that they should highlight in their reel.
I think what helped me is when I was a student, I was aiming for, like, I created a folder and I was stalking for weeks, if not months. I was just like getting every piece of information from every studio that I ever was impressed by. So Blur Studio Cinematics, Digic Pictures, Platige, all those studios, I was just gathering screenshots of what I deemed to be high fidelity, high quality assets. I was saving them there, and I was also keeping tabs on like who made them, and I was looking on the ArtStation. So basically I had like a benchmark and also had a goal, and I knew, okay, so maybe this person entered the studio 3 years ago and they had at this given time 5 projects on their portfolio which were looking like this. So this gives you like a benchmark and something you can achieve, right? It's a goal that you know you can achieve. So I would say if you're aiming for props or like a studio that is very heavily working on stylized stuff, just focus on making your portfolio look like that. And you know, try to appeal to the studios that you want to be working on because even if you don't get there now, maybe you will get there eventually, as long as you keep improving your portfolio and putting pieces that are matching that style. But with that being said, again, realistically speaking, it's good to slightly diversify your portfolio. So again, I would put like, I don't know, 60-70% effort in where you want to be, but I would also keep an eye on like available jobs coming up, and I would put stuff that you know, gonna get you there just in case.
Yeah, diversifying. That actually kind of fits into place with Alatrava's question, which basically asks the same thing, but for ArtStation. So would you say that basically everything that you just said can also apply to ArtStation, not just a demo reel, or are there a couple of different things that you can do with ArtStation because it is so massive?
I think when you look at like demo reel sometimes works to your benefit, sometimes it's not. So when you look at something in context, when you look at something in shot, when it just you see like an environment but the camera moves quickly, you don't focus as much on the details. When you open one's ArtStation and you suddenly see there's a single frame, you're gonna start analyzing, and like stuff that is maybe visible for a fraction of a second in the corner, suddenly maybe it's not looking good, or maybe you forgot to turn subdivision on some model. Like people are gonna nitpick the details if they are given the chance to. But if you have like a bad music in your reel or something like this, it could also work against you if you have bad editing or like weird effects. So I would say on ArtStation, it used to be very different from what it is now. So I can speak to my experience when I was uploading stuff a few years ago. I think now the main target audience and the people that are on ArtStation nowadays are very different, because even I myself sometimes upload something and it doesn't get as much reach as it used to. But I would say, like I mentioned in the beginning, try to if you have one asset, maybe present it in a few different scenarios. So you somewhat mitigate the risk by just like putting your eggs in different baskets, right? Like maybe you have a render of something, and maybe you do like a breakdown of how you did the render. So maybe you get wider reach to the audience, and people see, oh, okay, they did this in this way, and this is the final result. So I would try and like spread the posts a bit. Like it used to be like you would post just one big post. I don't think this approach works nowadays. I think you just need to throw stuff and see what sticks.
And you were mentioning that too with one of the ice scenes, and you were like, well, you can make a post just of this one glacier. You can make a post of this under the water over here. You had that very detailed boat that was in the distance, so you could make a post about that. So that's all very insightful. It definitely is what you have been talking about this whole stream. Now, in all of that, we have seen that you, as Dmitry, sometimes you get lost in the details. And Beyond Yume asks, how do you not get lost in the details? So how do you understand, like, okay, I got a deadline coming up. I can't really worry about like all these different primers right now. It looks good as it is. How do you self-edit yourself for something along those lines?
So I think it's important, like it comes with experience. This is something that you cannot substitute by like I could give you an advice, but until you've experienced and made those mistakes yourself, you're not going to be able to judge those things. But looking at an image now, I can see if that's something I would do as a personal project or not, because when I look at the image, I start analyzing. I think, okay, this asset is going to be 5 days of work. This is going to be like, I've just basically look at the image, and I don't look at the picture as a whole. I start looking at like this corner. What do I have here? I have here a boat. A boat is going to take me maybe a couple of weeks, but maybe a week of more research, and I need to go to a museum to see how it looks. In here, I have a house. 3 days of work. In here, I have something else. So you just need to kind of objectively start breaking the picture into segments and seeing what you have in each segment and what could be substituted. And you would also need to think, okay, so maybe I have the concept with people in it. If I remove the people, would it still feel the same? Or like if I remove some objects that I'm not confident doing, so how would it feel? So I think the best way is just going bit by bit and analyzing the concept before you start working on it. And if you're already in the project and you're already starting to get lost in the details, which happens to everybody, even professionally, I think what helps is having some sort of just posting it, right? Getting feedback, getting people to tell you, hey, this is looking cool, but what is what is this? Are you going to be working on this piece as well? Are you going to be finishing to the same standard? And the important thing working in a studio, I think, is iterations and, bringing everything to a certain level, which is good enough. And then, making sure that the other pieces match, and only then making the next step instead of having something that looks really good. And then like the other 3/4 of the environments are not looking good.
So yeah, and that's an interesting thought as well, because I can see, like, I was talking to our Ninja moderator earlier about this guitar in the background, and I can see when somebody plays something, and then I can conceptualize how long it would take me to learn how to play that thing. But the only reason why I know that is because of how much I have gotten lost in playing guitar and stuff like that. So it's almost like, yeah, you should get lost a little bit, so then you know how much time it takes. And then at that point, then you can look at something and be like, oh, I remember when I got lost in that, it took me this much time. And then, so it almost sounds like when somebody talks to you about a project, you can conceptualize from start to finish how long it'll take because of all your experience, which is super helpful to have, I think, as a freelancer. You already answered 3D Pixels questions about the UDIMs for the demo. There is a question for somebody that is looking to transfer from VFX industry specifically into environment art after 4 years of working across various commercial projects. And they're just curious about, could you share your suggestions or tips on effective scattering techniques? Now, real quick, before you get into that, I just want to let everybody know that if you're interested about, a little bit more how Dmitry does things, we have something real special for everybody here right now. If you go to Gnomon Workshop and you use the discount code DK20, you get 20% off until April 7th. So we are going to be trying to get through all of these questions, but for everybody that's here right now, or if you watch this stream before April 7th, you'll be able to get 20% off Dmitry's Gnomon Workshop right now, which is great. And also, if you RSVP'd, we'll be giving a free workshop away through email as well. And then I believe, Dmitry, you're also giving one away. We're just giving stuff away over here on the stream.
So if you stay tuned on Instagram, I should be in the next week or so doing a raffle. In comments section, I'll be making a post and explaining the rules and how we'll be choosing the winner. It's going to be just like a random comment generator or something, and I'm gonna pick a winner, and the person who wins gonna get a 1 year free subscription to all Gnomon workshops, which is amazing, and it's a lot of money, so a lot of knowledge. Yeah.
So make sure to follow Dmitry over there on Instagram, and we'll make this our final question, but as much information as you have. So again, for a Maya user, scattering can be stressful, at least for me. This is from Luca Cataneo, and they asked, could you please share your suggestions or tips on effective scattering techniques, and then I guess specifically in Maya?
I think specifically in Maya, I use Mush because I don't think there is any other way to scatter in Maya except for V-Ray scatter in the new version of V-Ray. But I would say that in the studios nowadays, you don't get to use Maya as much for scattering specifically. You mostly do it in Houdini. So if you're looking to transition into VFX, I would start looking into Houdini a bit more in terms of scattering, and I would maybe even just download stuff from Megascans and like create a scene just to, try those tools and just render it with the default render engine. But if it's personal projects and it's Maya you're looking for, I would say Mush, and there's a bunch of tutorials for Autodesk how to use it, or V-Ray Scatter.
So that actually also answers Gon's question about Houdini, specifically in environment creation and what its role contributes to a little bit. But another question, Dmitry, if everyone here in the stream, they want to keep up with you and they want to talk to you, can they hit you up on Instagram and ask you even more questions there?
Yeah, absolutely. Once in a while, I do like a Q&A stories, and this is a good opportunity to ask me those things. I think that on day-to-day basis, I don't use Instagram as much as I should be to post stuff. So sometimes I miss DMs and messages and comments. Sometimes those things get lost. But whenever I do a Q&A session and I post a story with Q&A, that's the great place, because then I just spend the next day actually looking and thinking and replying to those. So. But you can still send me a DM if you want, and I might be able to maybe reply to it.
Awesome. Now, you should definitely keep up with Dmitry. If you're trying to keep up with us, you can follow us at Gnomon_school on all of our platforms. You can also check us out at www.gnomon.edu. For you, Dmitry, is there anything else, like anywhere else we can keep up to date with you? I know we got your Instagram. I know we got your ArtStation. I know we know you on Gnomon Workshop. Any other stuff that you could tell us about coming up that we should keep an eye out for? Shogun is good. I do support that. It is a very good show. You should watch it if you haven't gotten a chance. I'm excited to see your episode. I don't know which one it is, but I'm excited to see it. But anything else?
I think one cool thing that I would like to show is, if we could show back my screen, is Unreal Engine, right? So this kind of ties to the previous question of whether or not people should be scattering in Maya. I think Unreal Engine is starting to get a bit more and more traction, and you're looking here at 24 UDIMs, even more. I think 28 different UDIMs of 4K. And some of it is 8K, and we have more buildings behind. All of it also is quite a few UDIMs, and it runs smoothly in real time, and you could go in any moment to path tracing. So moving forward, I know for a fact I will be using a bit more Unreal Engine. So this is something that I will be probably showing more and more on my social media, but I would say whoever is looking to do some scattering and some stuff in VFX, I would also not neglect the video game side of the industry, and I would stay up to date with those things, even just to get some transferable knowledge, because sometimes those things, they kind of bleed from one software to the other. So maybe it's a feature in Unreal Engine, but maybe it's the same workflow that you will be using in Houdini. So it's just one of those things to keep in mind as well.
I mean, that looks amazing. Unreal constantly just impresses me. I just finished Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Tekken 5 looks amazing. That obviously was one of the most. I thought it was a photo when we first looked at it yesterday, and then you started moving, and I was like, oh wait. So it's just very cool. Well, thank you so much, Dmitry. We really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Make sure you go and follow Dmitry on their Instagram to keep up to date and check out all the awesome stuff that they're doing. And hopefully it won't be too long till you come back, Dmitry. Maybe we can just talk about Unreal next time, which would be super fun.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks, everybody. I see we still have some other questions as well, so will we have time to answer those? Or
how are you looking on time?
I have time.
Okay. Well, I think if our audience is okay with it and you're okay with it, I think we could run through a few other questions, because I have stored quite a few over here on our list, and I think a lot of them are asking about environments and different programs, but I think one that is interesting that came in pretty recently is what you think of how do you handle or go about color variation in Painter? And the specificity of that is a little loose.
Quite specific, yeah. I tend to just start with the color that we see the most, and then I start introducing variation to it, and then on top of that, I add a couple of fill layers with maybe a few subtle masks of different hues. But I would not try and unless you have a texture that kind of matches it, which is probably the best thing to do. So if you have the base texture that's kind of boring base that matches 50-60% of what you have, that's already job done. You use the texture and then you add smaller stuff on top. The important thing, I guess, is just the shapes themselves in which the variation comes in, whether or not it's leaking, maybe it's damaged, maybe it's different layers of paint. So that's difficult to mimic, and this should come from some solid grunge or texture that you're using.
Now, a couple of these have come through just for general advice. And one of these is, how do you get out of a situation where you're completely new, like you've never had any exposure to? Say you started a project or photogrammetry, and it's something you decided to include. So how do you go about doing it without knowing disappointments or dropping the project and actually learning a new skill? So bringing it into the grand scheme of things, as you were talking about one of your environments, you said doing about 70% of something that you actually know, a workflow that you're actually familiar with, and then a 30% workflow of something that's new. Do you think that divvying it up like that is really important? Or have you ever done a project where it's 100% new and I'm just going to do 100% new stuff?
I think 70-30 is a good, well, depends. If you want a piece on your portfolio, 70-30 is perfect. If you want just to learn something new and you have no expectations of whether or not it's going to make it to your final portfolio, because maybe the experimentation is going to teach you that maybe this is something you don't want to do, then in that case, it's perfectly valid. But again, if it's something that you are really not sure about, I would just start with that thing, do a separate test, see how you feel about it. If you feel confident enough that you can incorporate or substitute it with something else, you could do 70% and then introduce it. Maybe you don't like it. Maybe you substitute it with something else. Maybe let's say you have a house in the forest and you want to learn scattering. So you do a house, you start doing the forest, then you realize, actually, I would rather not do scattering at all. Not for me. I want to do modeling texturing. Then you have just a house. But you need to be prepared to not showcase that side of the experimentation if you're introducing it into a project.
I see. Well, then in that same communication of like focusing, when creating environments, oh, sorry, here we go. There we go. When creating environments, are you rendering every detail to the extent of this model, or is the idea of the foreground and background used to guide the level of detail throughout the environmental space? And I think when they say this model, they're talking about the, I guess it's crane, that you were just working on there, the generator crane.
I think the question more refers to, like, if you have a street, would you model the building that is closer to us in higher detail than the one that is further?
Right.
In which case, for a personal project, I think absolutely, and this is what keeps the project sustainable. So you can cut corners and you know where you cut corners. If you work in the studio, you don't have the luxury sometimes, because in one shot it might be the furthest building on the street, but in another shot, which you might not know of, maybe they're gonna come back in half a year and revisit the story, and they're gonna decide that they want the camera to be now right in front of the house. So in that case, sometimes you just, like, if you're assigned one asset, you just make it the highest quality you could possibly can in the time allocated. But again, working on personal projects or working on something that you have set a storyboard or set idea of what it's gonna be, I would not put any detail that you absolutely must in stuff that you don't need to.
And you'd been mentioning that about personal projects, and quite a few people also asked how to stay motivated in personal projects. And you had mentioned going to a personal project, leaving it, coming back, leaving it, coming back. So how and why do you even come back? You come back because you're like, oh, I have a new skill that I'm going to try and put in this old project. So how do you drive yourself to come back to an old project? Because that's essentially you staying motivated to work on a personal project, right?
I think you need to find, like, the motivation can vary, right? Like, sometimes you start working in the studio and maybe you work in a position that you're currently not happy with, or maybe you believe that you have more potential that you are currently being, so what you could do, like, for example, if you keep being given small props, but you believe you could do an environment, probably the studio is not going to gamble and give you an environment just, for the sake of it. But if you have the bandwidth and you have the motivation to prove yourself, maybe you do an environment at home and you bring it to work and say, hey guys, look what I did after work. And then everybody, gonna start trusting you more. So that maybe is one part of your motivation. Maybe you are lagging behind, right? Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you are now started working on something, but the tasks that you are getting are too big for you. Or maybe they are, perfectly measured for you, but you have imposter syndrome. So once you do something to teach yourself the skills necessary, suddenly the work becomes easier and you trust yourself more. So it could be that sort of motivation.
Yeah, and there's different avenues, of course, to achieve that. But that's really good and helpful. So for a final question, I think this one's pretty loaded. We got through a lot of questions. Thank you all for your questions. What do you think the future of CG artists and environment artists will look like going forward?
That's a loaded.
Yeah, it's loaded.
Yeah. I would say nobody knows. And just as nobody knew that generalists are going to be the most wanted thing in the studios right now, because back in the day when I was starting, everybody was telling me, no, you need to specialize. But now, because I do everything, I can find lots of jobs and I can switch between positions easily. I think nobody knows. And even looking at the future, right? Like, you could look at it in like a positive way. Hey, like, maybe things are gonna be good. Maybe things are just gonna slightly change. Or you could think, okay, maybe the future is not gonna be good. But when you think in a slightly negative way, you're avoiding, like, you're just gonna be demotivated and you're not gonna get to, wherever you want to be in like next 5-10 years. But also, let's say the future is not going to be good. In that case, you could argue that it's not going to be good for everybody else. So in that case, it doesn't matter. So you might as well double down and put the love and the effort into what you're doing, and then just adjust and adapt. And this is one of the important things that somebody once gave me as an advice. Don't be a dinosaur. You need to adapt. And that's the only thing I can say about the future. So whatever the future brings, we will need to adapt. And I think as long as we are happy and we are whole with what we are doing and we are putting a lot of effort into it, we're going to succeed. And if we need to adjust and change something, then we will have to do it. And whoever manages to do that is going to be successful and, going to enjoy the perks of the industry. And, it's going to be great.
That was exceptionally well put. As a famous martial artist once said, you must be like water. And I think
Exactly.
it's a fantastic takeaway. And of course, if any of y'all want to keep up with Dmitry, again, follow him on Instagram, see what he's doing. Of course, we have the 20% off for everyone that's here. Head over to Gnomon Workshop, DK20. You'll also be entered into a raffle. If you RSVP, we'll be sending that out via email. And then, like Dmitry said, they are also running a giveaway on their Instagram. Thank you so much for being here. This was amazing. This was awesome. Appreciate it so much. And thank you all for viewing. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.